The old standby states that if you want to avoid trouble, you don't talk about politics, sex, or religion. So here we go with something that's pretty much going to combine all three. The horror genre has a long and, at times, troubled history with gender politics, but it is not exclusive to the horror genre by any means. Fiction in general, drama in general, going back to the most ancient of forms, has, by and large, come from a male perspective. This comes in large part from where the power in any given society rested at the time of the creation of that art. And while there have been better periods and worse periods for women, it can't really be stated that women had an equal say in the culture. It was more of an underculture, a secondary or even a counterculture of feminist view that has, until very recently, risen along with the main story of our people. His story. So I think it's important that when you look at the horror genre, which is a direct connection to some of the most ancient storytelling forms, whether we're talking about stories told around a fire in a cave about the saber-toothed tiger, or the traditional Greek tragedy, or the Shakespearean take, it becomes obvious that the male point of view has had the lion's share of the last word on the subject. That's not true necessarily today, but we're not at the point where it's untrue either. The horror genre is significantly different than most other fields of drama. The most obvious reason for that is that it exists as a heightened form of drama, one which exaggerates our society in order to get its desired emotional resonance. But it is also a storytelling form that at times has fallen into very strict codes. We understand this has to happen in order for this to happen. And that's called a trope. The final girl is the most obvious trope when it comes to the discussion of gender politics and horror. And that's because the final girl is used to contrast the earlier girls in the story. Even the word final girl is arguably somewhat sexist, but I'm not going to focus on that because I don't mind being called a boy, and if I was female, I wouldn't really mind being called a girl. To me, fighting over that kind of vocabulary is placing the emphasis in exactly the wrong place. We have to start from a position of respect, and words like girl, which might be laden for some of the people hearing this with a certain amount of dark weight, is in itself not the issue. The issue is, are we treating people fairly? Are people being demeaned in our art? Because that is wrong. So let's take a quick breath and a step back. Where did the final girl come from? And what is she, really? I'm not going to try and suggest where the first final girl showed up on film. I'm just going to go with some easy touchstones that everyone watching this should have some familiarity with. Let's be careful, though. Because even before there was a cliche in place, subverting that cliche worked. And that's an odd thing. When Alfred Hitchcock kills off Janet Leigh at the beginning of Psycho, it works because we expect her to live. Now, modernly, we can look back and see that she was a promiscuous girl in a physical relationship before society deemed it appropriate. That's what that first scene in the hotel room is about. She dies in a hotel, which is not a mistake. There's a certain sexual identity being created. It's also not a coincidence that she dies at the hands of Mother, because the maternal female is acceptable to society in pretty much any form. It's really the younger, less traditional female role that is controversial. Right from the beginning of the modern horror era, we have characters that are subverting the traditional final girl trope, even before the trope truly had a chance to gain purchase. But it did just that. It did become a trope. And the reason for that is because it was done very well in a handful of films. Let's look at Halloween for a moment. Halloween gives us a trio of high school girls. On one hand, we have the promiscuous girl who's in a physical relationship with her boyfriend and is really just a carefree spirit. On the other hand, we have Laurie Strode, who is this pure virginal figure who has all the insecurities and the motherly instincts that are acceptable to society. And in the middle, we have Annie, who is kind of the girl that could go either way. And ultimately, she makes a decision about which way to go, and it costs her life. So because horror is about mortality and morality, you see that the sexual politics of this is that, yes, we do have a strong female character in Laurie Strode who survives an attack by an older male. But it's important to note that she survives it, at least in part, because she embraces a traditional role. That's not a feminist message, but the trappings are vaguely feminist. And that's the crux of the final girl problem as it pertains to feminism. The original Friday the 13th offers up a similar situation. Alice, our final girl, is not virginal in the film, but never explicitly shown to be not that. But she's given a moment to make a choice, much like Annie in Halloween. While playing Strip Monopoly, she comes up on a property she doesn't own and is supposed to take off at least her shirt. She seems to be reticent to do it, but maybe she's going forward it. We're not exactly sure. And at that moment, the filmmakers let her and us off the hook about making a moral determination by having the wind, nature, slam open the door and ending the game. Alice's decision right there is the moral decision that would either cost her her life or save her. Again, she's up against Mother, a puritanical, traditional figure of womanhood in the culture she lives. Does Alice represent the ideals of feminism? In some ways she does. In some ways she does better than Laurie Strode. But you have to ask yourself whether it's not a sort of polluted feminism. Again, we're seeing this character from a mainly male point of view. It's hard to imagine it being considered a feminist scene to have two girls and a guy play Strip Monopoly. After the beginning of the slasher boom, it became clear that formula was playing a larger role in these decisions than actual gender politics, and probably it was just the social winds at the time that had even started it down this road. There probably wasn't a conscious effort on behalf of the screenwriters to make these films into a message. It was just what was happening at the time. It was where the social mores were. And so they fit into the screenplay for the same reason that, well, Monopoly is a cultural touchstone. So Strip Monopoly could be a thing. If they had to invent a game and explain the rules to the audience, then that game wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't have any resonance with the audience. Monopoly meant something. The sexual mores at the moment meant something, so they were used to progress the story, to explain a little bit of the morality and mortality story being told to the audience on a level that would fly under the radar, but spoke directly to the subconscious part of the brain that decides whether we like or dislike a movie. What it comes down to is, do we relate to it? Completely alien experiences are never successful. To give you an example of that, Ridley Scott's film Alien feels like the adventures of space truckers, right? We have all the normal cultural touchstones in place, such as class warfare and silently both race and gender at play, but they're in the background, but they feel real and compelling because they represented where those issues were at the time of the making of the film. Yes, Sigourney Weaver does strip down to her underwear in her final confrontation with the alien, and that's as much about vulnerability in general as it is to do with anything about the politics of gender, but it isn't completely divorced from the issue either. Very recently, we've seen a push towards making pronouncements about gender politics inside the horror genre. Most recently, Blumhouse's remake of Black Christmas was promoted as being about gender equality, being about sexism, being about the feminist argument. That's a little unfortunate, because the small gains that had been made by the horror genre, even if it did come from a not pristine source, were actually impressive by cinema standards. Other commercial genres pale in their treatment of women to the horror genre in that respect. And yeah, there's always the bad girls that die to provide contrast. But think about what they're saying about that bad girl thing. These are girls who are succumbing to men, who are feeding the male audience's desire for more skin on screen. So of course they aren't making it, because to feed that kind of impulse is in itself to embrace a sexist society. The final girls, by not embracing that, by not taking off their clothes on camera, by not having sex with their boyfriends, are resisting it. And again, it comes from a male perspective, so it's not perfect. And yes, the exploitation elements are there, so it's not a perfect intellectual experience. But what it is compelling and present and much more meaningful than we've seen in other genres. So where should the future go? I don't think we need movies about gender equality. I don't think we need movies that are focused, that are thought pieces necessarily. What we need is well-written films that use the moment, where we are today. Not where the mouthpieces of a movement are, but where the society itself is. I look at the movies as an opportunity to build on our society, to talk about where we've been, where we are, where we're going. But the only way that's successful is if we have a fun time at the movies at the same time. And that requires some skilled writing. Hopefully, the high horse that far too many writers sit upon right now doesn't have that far to trot. Because I'd like to get back to a place where the stories are paramount. And if the social messages are there, the filmmakers are allowed to have a voice and to have ideas about our society. But rather than strictly being activists, they're actually intelligent mediators that are attempting to make a statement by making a statement, not screaming through a bullhorn. I think, too, we do a disservice to some of the great women who've come before in the genre. Women like Barbara Steele and Simone, who presented themselves as strong and capable. The short side of it is this. Majority of slasher villains are male. That doesn't mean all men are villains. The majority of survivors of slasher films are virginal females. That's not a statement unto itself about virginal females. But taken as a whole, you can see a little bit of our society in there. It's like the tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. Some of the greatest poetry ever written exists as song lyrics. And yes, they can be as meaningful as any great poet from any century. But first, they got to convince the audience to dance.